Have you ever wanted to hear or find yourself in the middle of the most intense and thrilling true crime, mysterious, and paranormal stories on the internet? Well, if you have, then you're in the right spot. Welcome to Mystery Files. Do you like horror stories? Because there are certain films that leave a mark on popular culture, etching themselves into the collective consciousness. For many, it's the scares, the thrill of seeing the horror brought to life on the big screen. But sometimes the line between fiction and reality blurs in terrifying ways. So if we rewind to 1988, when a seemingly harmless red-haired doll entered the world, its name? Chucky. Created by writer Don Mancini, Child's Play became an instant horror classic, where a child's toy was possessed by the soul of a vicious serial killer, Charles Lee Ray. And the film series followed, Chucky's twisted antics as he wreaked havoc on unsuspecting families. With its mix of dark humor and spine-chilling terror, it wasn't long before Chucky became a household name, joining the ranks of horror icons like Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees. But something far more disturbing was waiting just around the corner. Because while Child's Play terrified audiences for over 3 decades, what most people do not realize is that this fictional tale of a killer doll inspired 2 horrifying real-life crimes. And these weren't just your ordinary crimes. They were brutal, senseless acts of violence that shocked the world and forever changed the way people viewed Chucky. So out of these 2 stories, let's begin with the first. Our story begins in December 1992 in Manchester, England. And Suzanne Capper was a 16-year-old girl described by many as shy, vulnerable, and eager to please. But she did live a troubled life, often staying at friends' homes just to escape her unstable house. And one of those friends was a woman by the name of Jean Powell. But little did Suzanne know, the people that she trusted the most would become her worst nightmare. Because you see, at Jean Powell's home, a strange group of individuals gathered. It was Powell's ex-boyfriend, Glenn, and he lived there. And so did Bernadette McNeely, a woman with 3 children, and her boyfriend, Anthony Dudson. And there was just kind of this, constant stream of visitors that would come in and out of the house at all times of the day and night. But despite that chaos, Suzanne kind of felt like she belonged there, like this was her place now. But it wasn't very long before things took a dark turn. You see, the group, led by Bernadette McNeely, began harboring strange resentments towards Suzanne. I mean, the reasons for their growing hostility were disturbingly petty. For example, some claimed that Suzanne had taken a coat that had belonged to Bernadette. Others said it was because she had given Bernadette and Anthony lice after sharing a bed. But, whatever the reason, what happened next was nothing short of evil. Because like a day that will live in infamy, on December 7th, 1992, Suzanne Capper walked into what she believed would be an ordinary day. She had no reason to suspect that anything unusual was waiting for her that day. But as she crossed into the threshold of what she thought was her friend's home, her life right there changed forever. Because the moment Suzanne kind of stepped through the door, she could really tell and sense that something was extremely wrong. I mean, even the air in the house just felt really heavy, oppressive, and it was clear that almost as if it carried a secret that everybody knew but her. And really, before Suzanne could even get her head around anything and react, her so-called friends, people that she trusted, turned on her with this aggression so sudden, so brutal, that she could barely process what was going on. And some could say that it began innocently enough, though. You know, maybe just a push or a cruel laugh as though it was some kind of a twisted joke. But the joke quickly turned into a nightmare. Because you see, they grabbed Suzanne and they dragged her deeper into the house, throwing her down onto the cold floor as they circled around her like predators toying with their prey. And Suzanne's on the ground and she's just fighting to kind of understand what's going on. She's trying to make sense of this betrayal. But there was no logic in it. There was no logic in their cruelty. Only pure malice. So, and this is tough to hear, guys, but that's a warning right now. But the first act of degradation came when they shaved her head bald. Clumps of her long, dark hair just fell to the ground. And with each pass of the clippers, they stripped her of her beautiful hair, but also her sense of identity and dignity. And then once her head was fully shaved clean, they, laughed and kept taunting her, calling her all of these names for no reason, mind you, these petty things. And Suzanne's eyes at that point just kind of watered up with all these tears. But she refused to cry to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But sadly, this was only the beginning. Because her tormentors were not content with just humiliating her, no. They stripped her naked, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. So cold she was that the chill of the room's air bit at her skin. But the true cold came from the soulless eyes of those that once she considered friends. And then the real nightmare began. You see, at first they tied her up, her wrist bound very tightly, cutting into her skin as they dragged her to the corner of the room, where then she would be tortured for the next several days. And like an ocean, the attack came in waves, each one worse than the last. I mean, at first they jabbed needles filled with amphetamines into her veins, sending her mind just spiraling into a state of confusion and fear. And the drugs just kind of pulsed through her bloodstream, warping her sense of time and reality, if you could imagine that. She couldn't tell whether hours had passed by or mere moments. And the pain, of course, from being tortured was constant. A relentless assault on her body and, at that point, her soul. Why is all of this happening? Oh, what? You think I took your coat one day? What is going on? And then the beatings happened, and the beatings were absolutely savage. I mean, they grabbed whatever they could find, wooden spoons, belt buckles, anything that could be used as a weapon just to hurt her and to break her will further and further down. So the belts would lash across her bare skin, leaving these deep welts and bruises everywhere, while the wooden spoons cracked against her bones, splintering with each strike. And she didn't cry, but at this point the pain was overwhelming, so Suzanne's screams filled the room. But no one, absolutely nobody, came to help. They only mocked her pain, laughing at her suffering. Oh, and then there were the burns. Yep, the cigarettes, their glowing tips inches away from her skin before pressing them in against her flesh, searing with this intense heat. So at this point, as you know, the smell of skin just filled the air. Suzanne cried out as each burn left her body marked with pain. But the worst part of it was not the physical agony. It was the psychological torment that they were putting her under. And throughout the endless hours of torture, they played a song. And they played this song on repeat. A twisted, nightmarish track that would haunt her for every waking moment. And that's where the theme of today's video comes in. Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play? by 150 volts, the voice of Child Plays Doll Chucky echoed through the room as this upbeat yet chilling rhythm throbbed in the background.
I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
And of course, the lyrics were meant to entertain. But in this house of horrors, they took on a new, sinister, horrible meaning. And Bernadette, one of the main instigators for no reason, she would lean in really close, her breath hot on Suzanne's ear, and she would whisper this chilling phrase over and over and over again. Chucky's coming to play. Over and over and over and over like a broken record. Bernadette taunted her, saying it with this twisted glee in her face. The words were so much until it just drilled into Suzanne's brain, each syllable deepening her despair. And the sound of Chucky's voice, once fictional, became all too real. It was a soundtrack now that had become pure torment. And mind you, not for seconds, moments, minutes, or hours, but for days. Suzanne's world became a blur of this pain and terror and torment, a walking nightmare from which she could not escape. And in this nightmare, the house was her prison. And the tormentors, who were once her friends, were relentless. And the pain of betrayal might have been the worst thing. But even worse, every single time Suzanne thought that the torture was over and that she had endured the worst that they could possibly throw at her, they found new ways to hurt her, to break down her spirit. I mean, she longed for it to all end, but the end would not come. At least, not yet. Now, I want you to imagine being a young woman or man, early in life, you have everything to look forward to, and you love your life a lot. And for somebody over the course of days, almost a week, to break down your spirit so much to the point where you are praying to God that it just all ends. Imagine how much pain she was truly in. So finally, after nearly a week of unimaginable suffering, the group decided it was time to finish what they had started. So they decided to grab Suzanne and then literally drag her from the house, her body limp and broken at this point, and they shoved her into the car. And she was, of course, at this point too weak to resist. Her mind, of course, way too shattered now to even comprehend what was going on or happening. So what they did, because they're so smart, is they drove her to this very secluded area, far from the eyes of anyone who, might help Suzanne. And once they did this, they stopped right near this little patch of woods. And that's when Suzanne was literally pulled and dragged out of the car, her feet scraping against the rough ground as they took her to a clearing that was right out the way. That's when the wind howled at them and it kind of woke Suzanne up for a moment. And Suzanne thought that maybe this was it, maybe it's over, and that maybe they'll actually leave me alone now because they've beaten me and bruised me, but at least I'm still alive. But of course, Suzanne's optimism was only temporary because they did have one final horror in store for her. Like something you would see out of a horror movie, they doused her whole body in gasoline. The acrid scent was just filling up her nostrils. I mean, she was literally soaked from head to toe, and the liquid was just kind of clinging to her skin like a death sentence. And at this point, she tried to scream, but her throat was far too raw from the days of crying out. So her body just stood there and shook in fear as the realization set in. Then, in one single cruel act, they lit a match. And before you knew it, flames engulfed her. I mean, the fire consuming her clothes, her skin, her hair. The pain, as you could imagine, was beyond anything she had ever imagined. It felt as though her entire body was being devoured inch by inch. But even in the face of such agony, Suzanne fought. And yes, this is a horrible story, but if you're still watching, you're going to be glad you did, because this ending is truly crazy. She fought at this point with every ounce of strength that she had left. She was on the reserve tank, but she was still fighting. And at this point, all of her friends had left. And through nothing but sheer willpower, Suzanne literally crawled while her body was lit on fire. And her skin was blistering and peeling. But she ended up crawling, with all of this going on, toward a nearby road. And of course, each movement, each grab of grass and dirt was excruciating. But she refused to give up. Because hell had no fury like a woman scorned, right? And her determination to survive, to make sure her attackers paid for what they have done to her, was stronger than the fire that was literally consuming her. And by some miracle, a passing motorist saw her and rushed to her aid. And despite, her horrific injuries, Suzanne clung to life just long enough to deliver a final act of courage. Because in her last moments, she named what happened, and she named the attackers, ensuring that they would face justice for the unimaginable torment that they had put her through. And unfortunately, Suzanne Capper died in the hospital. May she rest in peace. Her body ravaged by the burns that covered over 80% of her flesh. But even in death, she remained a fighter. And because of her bravery, her killers, once friends, were brought to trial and held accountable for all of their cruelty. And Suzanne's story would not be forgotten. And that's why I'm telling it to you. It is a tragic reminder of the darkness that can reside within those that we trust the most. So in this case, it wasn't a killer that was put into a doll, it was a killer that was inspired from a doll movie. Think of the odds of that. Gary Hurt was a 17-year-old honor student who claimed to have a horrifying secret. But the secret wasn't really a secret, since he told every single person that he met exactly what he did. But of course, nobody took him seriously. No one, that is, until Olivia Toma came into the picture. Toma was not one of Hurt's usual crowd of hanger-ons. She was a beautiful and accomplished 19-year-old student at the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. And Hurt met her at the Waupaca County Fair in August 2003, where she had just won the beauty pageant. And he immediately set out to impress, appointing himself her unofficial bodyguard for the day. And after that, the two of them became friends, and inevitably Hurt decided to let her in on his deep, dark secret. In January 2004, he confessed to her something that he did in the past. Not too further past, but did in the past. However, he was only 17 years old, so it couldn't have been anything that bad, right? At first, Toma was disinclined to believe him, but as the fall progressed and Hurt repeated the story to her several times, she began to kind of wonder, was it possible that he was actually telling the truth? So she started sleuthing and just looking into the case, reading up on whatever had been covered in the papers. And every single thing that Hurt had told her matched up. And of course, that didn't mean a thing, he could, just like her, have followed the case in the press. But yet, Hurt's confession continued to nag at her. So eventually, she decided to talk to the police. And like everyone else, the detective working the Kapitsky case were skeptical at first. I mean, here was this honor student, an Eagle Scout, star athlete, and a young man who had received a personal commendation from the mayor for his charitable work. Why on earth would a kid like that commit such a horrific, rage-filled crime on someone who was, by all accounts, a stranger? Oh, my bad. It seems that I totally forgot to tell basically the whole story to you, so let's rewind just a little. Imagine on a dark night, the air becoming a little thick of smoke because of what was coming out of the tailpipe of the car that Gary Hurty flicked a switch on the dashboard of his 11-year-old Dodge Dynasty and then killed the lights. He took the stick shift into neutral and angled the vehicle towards the soft shoulder of Arrowhead Lane, this remote, dead-end road in Winnebago County, Wisconsin. And as you looked up, the night was actually moonless, the woods oppressive, pushing in from either side of the narrow lane. So Hurt at that point cut the engine, then sat for a while in the car, gathering his thoughts. He'd made this trip before, in fact, on a series of reconnaissance runs throughout the summer. So now, on the night of July 31st, 2003, he was ready. This was it. Opening the car door he did, and he hefted his 240-pound frame out of the driver's seat and walked to the trunk. There, he popped the trunk, and he fetched a 12-gauge shotgun, and he checked the breech and made sure it was loaded. And with the shotgun in his hand, he ran the palm of his free hand over the 8-inch buck knife he had strapped to his waist. But he didn't think that he'd have to need that, but you never know. Everything had been planned in great detail, and the knife was his fallback plan. So, satisfied with the weapons check, he quietly closed the lid on the trunk, then started walking down the road. His destination lay only a quarter mile ahead, and Glenn Kapitsky was the polar opposite to Gary Hurt. Where a 17-year-old Hurt was a straight-A student at Weyawega Fremont High School, Kapitsky was a 37-year-old college dropout. And where Hurt had surrounded himself with an army of sycophantic hanger-ons, Kapitsky was a reclusive loner who had only his pet dog for company. And where Hurt was the first boy in history of Winnebago County to achieve Eagle Scout status, Kapitsky was a failed stand-up comedian prone to these eccentric behaviors. For example, once he had poured his entire life savings into this bizarre campaign to run for the US presidency. Another time he had announced his candidacy for the House of Representatives. But these days, however, he was confined himself into this rundown cabin on Arrowhead Lane and wrestled with his bipolar disorder. And the only visitor that he ever received was his mother, Shirley. Tonight, however, he was to have another guest, and this one was an unwelcome one. So at this moment, Kapitsky was sound asleep in his bedroom when Hurt arrived and slipped into the garage through an unlocked door. Then Kapitsky's dog, a half-lab mongrel, started barking, causing Hurt to kind of freeze in place. He hit a snag. He definitely did not expect the dog. The reconnaissance before had never shown a pet of any kind. But now we know it was a stray that Kapitsky had taken in just a few days earlier. For a moment, as a soldier would think, Hurt kind of said, I might have to abandon this mission. The abort sound was going off in his head when all of a sudden the dog quieted down. And judging by the lack of noise from inside the house, its alarm call hadn't woken up the owner. Hurt said good at that point, and he was relieved. And that's when he slowly twisted the handle on the inner leading door and eased his way right into the house. Moments later, there he was, looking down on Glenn Kapitsky, who was lying face down and naked on his bed. A prod with the barrel of the shotgun brought Kapitsky reluctantly awake. For a moment, he appeared kind of disoriented, blinking into a pool of this amber light created by the bedside lamp. Then his senses kind of registered that there was a man with a gun, and he scrambled away out of his bed, grabbing the corner of the covering and trying to pull it up to his chin in an instinctive, attempt at modesty. Please, he whimpered, please don't hurt me. But Hurt ignored the pitiful pleas. He'd come here with a mission, and he was determined to see it through. So Hurt said, turn around at that point, and Kapitsky said, please don't shoot me. And Hurt said, don't make me then, turn around. And Kapitsky did as he was told. What choice did he have? Please, he sobbed, please. And that was when Hurt brought the muzzle of the shotgun level with the back of Kapitsky's head, and he pulled the trigger. Now imagine that the shotgun shell exploded with 2,700 foot-pounds of force as the slug ripped through Kapitsky's skull and entered into his brain cavity, liquefying the soft tissue within. Kapitsky was dead before he even hit the floor, but still his killer was not satisfied. So at this point, drawing the 8-inch hunting knife, he plunged it twice into Kapitsky's back. and the blade ran so deep that it embedded itself into the wooden floor below, and Hurt had to use both of his hands like he was lifting up a 100-pound rock from the ground to withdraw it. But he still wasn't satisfied. So then he flipped Kapitsky over and stabbed him in the chest, penetrating his heart and slashing a few drops of blood into the air and onto his knife's leather sheath. And then it was over. Hurt then remained long enough in the house to slip Kapitsky's bundle of keys into his pocket as a memento of the night's dark deeds. Then he locked the cabin door and walked casually away, disappearing into the trees. Glenn Kapitsky's body would lay undiscovered for 2 days. Then, unfortunately, his mother, Shirley, became concerned that he wasn't answering his phone and decided to drive over. Just imagine being a mother and calling your son and not getting an answer for 2 days and becoming increasingly concerned, and then when you finally go to visit him to make sure he's okay, this happens. Clearly, she walked in on a truly horrific scene. Kapitsky may only have been dead for a couple of days, but the 85-degree plus temperature had taken its toll. The body was so badly decomposed that the authorities at first thought that he had died of natural causes. Yet it was only when a pathologist noticed liquefied brain tissue seeping from a quarter-sized head wound that the real cause of death was determined. And then a closer examination uncovered the 3 stab wounds inflicted after the victim was already dead. But who would have wanted to kill Glenn Kapitsky? This man was a harmless recluse with no friends, no known enemies, and certainly nothing worth stealing. And the sheer brutality of this crime suggested a deep-felt rage. But looking into Kapitsky's background produced no one who might have harbored such extreme feelings against him. Neither did the physical search of the murder scene turn up anything that qualified as evidence. It was only after detectives started canvassing the neighborhood that the first clue would emerge. And it was one neighbor who reported seeing the same car cruising Arrowhead Lane on repeated nights. However, his description of the vehicle was vague, and he hadn't gotten a good look at the license plate or the occupant in it. The car that the neighbor had spotted was, in fact, Gary Hurt's Dodge Dynasty. Hurt had driven the route several times as he planned his perfect murder. He had even on occasion taken his friend Eric Wenzelow with him, although he kept Wenzelow in the dark as to his intentions. In the aftermath of the murder, though Hurt was a lot less discreet, he'd pulled off the perfect crime and outsmarted the police. And for some reason, maybe pride or ego, he wanted the world to know about it. So, by the time that the school year got underway, virtually everyone at Weyawega Fremont High School had heard Hurt's story about how he had shot and stabbed Glenn Kapitsky. He even incorporated his boasts into his athletic regime. Getting himself psyched up before Friday night football games, Hurt would rumble menacingly, "I killed someone. That's right, I killed someone." But as Toma told her story to the police, they began to realize that she actually knew details of the crime that had not been reported in the media. I mean, how is it possible that she could have known these things unless she had heard it from the killer himself? So on January 28th, Toma had persuaded to engage Hurt in a telephone conversation, with the police, of course, listening in. And it didn't take her long to turn the discussion to the unimaginable crime, and Hurt immediately took the bait, describing it in detail how he had planned and executed the crime, ending with the bold assertion that the police would never solve this case. Well, he was wrong in that regard, because the following day, Weyawega Fremont High's golden boy was led away from the principal's office in handcuffs. Gary Hurt stood trial for the first-degree murder of Glenn Kapitsky in January 2005. Now, given the taped conversation in which he had confessed to the murder, plus the victim's blood which had been found on his knife sheath, it was pointless denying guilt. But Hurt had another idea. he was going to try to get out of this. I mean, his attorney therefore opted for the next best thing, an insanity plea. And according to the defense, Hurt was a latent homosexual, and these urges became more intense when he had been drinking. This had led him into a sexual encounter with Kapitsky, one that he'd raged over for months afterwards. Eventually, that anger had reached a point where he had decided to return to Kapitsky's house and kill him. That, Hurt's lawyer asserted, was why there was so much overkill to the murder. His client was suffering from a psychotic depression that made him not guilty. I mean, yeah, okay, it was a clever strategy, but it lacked one thing: corroborating evidence. There was nothing to support the assertion that Hurt or Kapitsky was homosexual. Nothing to suggest that Kapitsky even knew Hurt or had even ever met him before the night of the murder. And on February 4th, 2005, the jury rejected Hurt's insanity plea and found him guilty of first-degree murder. Hurt was subsequently sentenced to life in prison. But I guess the question remains, why would this high-achieving young man, apparently with the world at his feet, commit such a senseless act of violence? The answer lies in Gary Hurt's conduct in the months after the murder, where it would have been prudent to keep his mouth shut. He just could not help but boast about what he had done. In that regard, this case echoes that of Leopold and Loeb, the two brilliant men who murdered a 14-year-old boy in order to prove their superiority. Gary Hurt had a similar drive, and despite all of his achievements, Hurt was deeply insecure, and committing the perfect murder and being able to boast about it somehow served to bolster his self-esteem. His only mistake, of course, was confiding in a woman who was not one of his sycophantic followers. And if it wasn't for that, he might well have indeed gotten away with the perfect murder.
3 days before Christmas in 1990, a chilling discovery in the snow-covered mountains of Oakley, Utah, shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Inside a remote family cabin, an unthinkable scene awaited: smoldering ruins and a sinister mystery. What happened here was no accident, and the truth would unravel a story so horrific it remains one of Utah's most haunting cases. Nestled high in the Utah mountains, the Tiede family cabin was the epitome of holiday perfection. Snow blanketed the trees, and the crisp winter air carried the promise of a peaceful Christmas getaway. For Rolf and Kay Tiede, their teenage daughters Lene and Trisha, and Kay's mother, Beth Potts, this trip was meant to be a cherished time for family bonding. But evil had other plans. You see, the cabin's secluded location, accessible only by snowmobile in the winter, offered privacy, but also vulnerability. And unbeknownst to the Tiedes, two strangers had been watching them, planning something monstrous. Vaughn Lester Taylor, who was 25, and Edward Stephen Deli, who was 21, had been wandering that area, breaking into vacant cabins and biding their time. So Taylor, familiar with the region due to his own family ties, knew the mountains all too well. He also knew that if he chose the right moment, no one could hear the screams. So as the family settled in on December 22nd, they were blissfully unaware that Taylor and Deli had been watching right outside in the snow-covered woods. The men had seen the family leave earlier that day and used that opportunity to sneak up to the house and silently break in. And then they just waited for the family to return. What happened next would turn the serene holiday scene into a night of terror. Okay, so when the Tiedes entered their cabin that evening, they were ambushed. Taylor and Deli burst in, armed and ruthless. The family's festive evening was shattered as chaos erupted. Now, you got to understand the relationship between Taylor and Deli. Taylor was by far the alpha, and Deli just seemed to go along with whatever Taylor wanted to do. Sometimes it seemed like Deli might grow conscious, but other times it seems he feared to betray his leader. So Taylor, the more aggressive of the two, wasted no time asserting his control. He was a man with nothing to lose, having already served time in prison for aggravated burglary. But this was a step into pure evil. So Beth Potts, who was Kay's mother, was the first to get brutally killed. She was shot at close range, and her body collapsed in a pool of blood on the living room floor. At this point, Kay tried to, shield her daughters, a brave act that any mother would do, but she too was executed in cold blood right in front of her daughters. And the father, Rolf, attempted to actually fight back, but in doing so he was shot multiple times. His daughters could only watch in horror as the scene unfolded. Blood soaked the carpets, and the once cozy cabin became a slaughterhouse. At this point, Rolf was shot multiple times, and he just laid there, motionless. So with Kay and Beth and Rolf dead, Taylor and Deli returned their attention to Lene and Tricia, the sisters, just 16 and 20 years old, and they were terrified, but they tried to remain calm. The men, however, had no intention of leaving any witnesses alive. But before abandoning the cabin, they doused the upper floors with gasoline. The acrid smell filled the air, and then they, all of a sudden, lit a match and set it ablaze. The fire quickly engulfed the rooms, consuming the family's Christmas decorations and the gifts that they had bought for one another. At this point, Taylor and Deli forced the sisters outside where the freezing cold bit at their skin, and the snow-covered ground glistened under the moonlight, an eerie contrast to the hellish flames consuming the cabin right behind them. So the killers each climbed onto a snowmobile, forcing one sister in front to drive while they rode behind, the cold barrels of their guns pressed to their backs. So the girls had no choice but to descend upon the mountain, and the chilling silence was only broken by the hum of the snowmobiles. And as they approached the main road, Lene and Tricia spotted their uncle, Randy Zorn, who had just arrived for a holiday visit, and he waved to them, but the sisters didn't dare respond. And their silent plea for him to stay away likely saved his life, because if they would have waved or if Randy would have got closer, they surely would have killed him too. But then, out of nowhere, minutes later, another snowmobile approached the main road, and Randy, puzzled and increasingly feeling uneasy, saw the rider and felt his stomach drop. The man was coatless, bloodied, and barely clinging to the snowmobile. It was Rolf. You see, Rolf was shot multiple times, and at that moment, on the ground, he knew his only way to save his daughters was to play dead. So he did, and he listened to every word that the killer said. His survival instincts kicked in, and his resolve to save his daughters would become a turning point in this horrible nightmare. So back at the cabin, when the fire was ignited, flames quickly consumed the room, and Rolf himself and his clothes started catching fire, so he desperately dragged himself into the shower. The freezing water extinguished the flames, but his injuries were quite severe. But despite the pain, he knew he had to act. With every ounce of strength he had, he stumbled outside and found a snowmobile. Battling the bitter cold and his injuries, he drove toward the main road, hoping to find help from somebody. Rolf's words to Randy were chilling. His wife and mother-in-law were dead, his daughters kidnapped. Randy then immediately called authorities, sparking a desperate manhunt to save the girls and to capture the killers. And Taylor and Deli forced Lene and Tricia into the family car at a nearby parking lot, leaving the snowmobiles behind. And then the car sped through the icy roads as law enforcement scrambled to intercept them. These roadblocks were set up, and officers braved the treacherous terrain, determined to stop the killers before it was too late. And then there was the chase, and the chase stretched across several towns, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Taylor, a volatile and unpredictable figure, seemed to relish in this chaos. Deli, though less dominant, followed Taylor's lead. his fear manifesting in compliance rather than resistance. Meanwhile, investigators reached the cabin and were confronted with a scene straight out of a horror movie. The upper floors were charred, the air thick with the stench of burnt wood and hair. Blood had actually seeped through the living room floorboards, forming icicles beneath the cabin in the freezing temperatures. Outside, the bodies of Kate and Beth were found covered in the snow, hidden by the killers in a sinister attempt to conceal their crimes. And right when you think that things couldn't have got any more sinister, all of a sudden, this clue was found. Because you see, among this wreckage, investigators found a crucial piece of evidence, a video camera. And inside it was a tape that, at first glance, appeared to hold innocent family memories. But when officers played it back, they were absolutely stunned. The footage showed Taylor and Deli inside the cabin, laughing and opening the Tiede family Christmas gifts. The killers had recorded their vile celebration, their complete lack of remorse, and it was preserved on videotape. And this tape would later become a key piece of evidence, providing insight into the mindset of the men responsible for this horror, which didn't only show their mea culpa, but also their mens rea. That's for all my criminal justice people out there. So now, after a tense pursuit, Taylor and Deli were finally cornered. And before they had a chance to take out the girls, the officers stormed the vehicle, rescuing Lene and Trisha, who were shaken but alive. The sisters' ordeal was over, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain forever. The killers then were taken into custody, their reign of terror brought to an end. But the questions lingered. What drove these men to commit such heinous acts? And how could such evil invade a season meant for peace and goodwill? From here, the legal proceedings were as dramatic as the crimes themselves. Von Taylor, the mastermind, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of capital murder in exchange for the dismissal of other charges. But a jury sentenced him to death, a fate that mirrored the brutality he had inflicted on his victims. Edward Deli, despite his role in the murders, was convicted of second-degree murder after a single juror refused to convict him of first-degree murder. So, he was sentenced to 5 years to life in prison, a decision that left the Tiede family and prosecutors stunned. And for Lene and Trisha, testifying against their captors was a harrowing experience. The young women had to relive the trauma on the stand, their bravery evident in their detailed and composed testimony. Rolf, too, actually became a key witness, his survival a testament to his determination and strength. And today, Von Taylor remains on death row, appealing his sentence over again. But Edward Deli remains still behind bars, unlikely ever to be paroled. Their names are etched into the annals of true crime, symbols of a senseless evil act that shocked a nation. The Tiede murders remain one of Utah's most chilling cases. In 2019, it was even made into a movie called The Utah Cabin Murders. I suggest you check it out right after this. But for the Tiede family, Christmas will forever be tied to the memories of that horrific night. Yet amidst the pain, there is resilience. Lene and Trisha survived unimaginable horror and found the strength to actually rebuild. And from there, each of them built incredible lives with love and children and persevered through the unimaginable. And speaking of the unimaginable, if you love stories like this, then you might just love this story even more. Imagine getting a restricted phone call and later figuring out, after multiple threats, that it's coming from within your own home. From there, you and the family spiral until the very end of this crazy story. And to watch that incredible story, make sure to click right up here in the top right corner. You don't want to miss this one, believe me. Well, that's all I got for you guys today. Cheers.